Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? There we go. Thank you. I appreciate the thumbs up, smiles, and other indications of engagement, or at least sensory perception. Hi there. Welcome. My name is Jim Cummings, and I'm assistant faculty in the Division of Emerging Media Studies here at Boston University, where I also serve as co-director of the college's Communication Research Center. And I'd like to welcome you all to the first ever fully virtual talk in the CRC's Colloquium Research Series. While I'm sure we've all been quite well acquainted with Zoom over the last couple weeks, I did want to quickly mention a few notes regarding functionality and etiquette. Please take a moment to guarantee that your mics are muted. If not, or they somehow become unmuted during the talk, it'd be very appreciated if you remuted yourself. Additionally, I'd like to note that today's talk will be recorded. So if you have any concerns about that, please let us know through chat channels, or alternatively, you're always more than welcome to not use video, and solely your name might be part of that recording. Additionally, I'd like to note that we will be doing a Q&A at the end of today's talk. Speaking of the talk, our speaker today is Kate Mays, who, at least for me, is in the top left corner of my screen. She's a doctoral candidate in the Emerging Media Studies program here at Boston University in the College of Communication, where she is also a CRC research fellow. Over the past few years, Kate has conducted research related to a variety of topics related to human-computer interaction, human-machine communication, political communication, journalism, and other fields. A common theme in her work has been the role of different affordances of new and emerging technologies in terms of their influence on the social relationships that we have with one another. Something we've likely all been thinking about much more so in the last week or two. Today, she'll be sharing with us some of her most recent work related to this topic, and a topic that I think will become only increasingly more important to understand with each passing year, that topic being our social and relational perceptions, not of just new technologies in general, but related to embodied robots and artificial intelligence. Speaking of technological affordances and social relations, this is where I would normally say, please join me in warmly welcoming our speaker, which may be difficult to do muted. Feel free to clap or use icons or whatever the case may be in the chat to otherwise emote that welcoming. But with that said, please help me welcome Kate Mays.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate the warm welcome, Jim. I also appreciate the excuse for putting on real clothing here. It's been interesting time, certainly, but thank you for taking time out of your day to listen to the talk that, as Jim mentioned, is about the relational dynamics and perceptions of robots and artificial intelligence. There's a vast literature on human-robot interaction already. Actually, you know what? I just realized I need to share my screen. I'm sorry. I haven't used Zoom that much. Let me get the PowerPoint up here. And then, we good now? Thanks, Jim. Okay. All right. Getting used to Zoom. Okay. So as I mentioned, there's a vast literature on human-robot interaction already, and robotics has been around in certain spheres for quite a while. In particular, robots have primarily proliferated in the industrial sphere. Not surprisingly, research on this has found that people have a preference for jobs in which they're working alongside robots when they serve to augment human work rather than have robots perform jobs in place of humans. This earlier research on industrial robots has been more negatively valenced generally because it's premised on fears of job removal and human replacement. And as you can see here in these pictures, right, the robot technology it's mostly mechanical arms. There's really no need for this kind of embodied robot yet in the spheres that it's primarily been, but that might be changing in the coming years as AI and robot technology is advanced to a degree now that has more positive possibilities rather than just job replacement in industrial sectors, but ways in which robots may actually fit into our lives. And with that development, the sophistication, as you can see, of their appearance has grown, right? We see actual full bodies and some faces and arms and those sorts of things. And as these pictures demonstrate, right, we also see robots in different kinds of roles as caretakers, as companions, or helpers for the elderly, which could be increasingly important to close the elder care gap that might be coming for us as the boomer generation ages. There's also therapeutic robots that have been shown to help neuroatypical children. For example, helping autistic children learn and practice socialization. Robot tutors are also being explored as education aids for learners. And I should note that these types of social robots are not widely proliferated yet, but we can start to guess at how they may be received by looking at their present forebears and these AI-enabled digital voice assistants like Amazon's Alexa. These are just some newspaper headlines that I've pulled of people writing about Alexa and what they've noticed with the technology. And as we've seen with Alexa and others of its ilk, like Google Home, these have been adopted into homes. Some people have started treating the technology like a friend or a companion as much as a functional utility. There are also concerns about how adapting the social technology may be socializing people in certain ways and not necessarily positive, as you see here. We may determine men's suitability for dating based on how they treat a virtual female assistant, right? Kids might be learning to yell commands at the voice assistant and not say please, not be polite. And so there are considerations not only at the individual level of how people are using the technology, but also a broader social level for what that use might mean in terms of how people treat others. I also want to bring in here too, not just robots, but the mechanics that make robots work. So artificial intelligence, right? AI has already been disseminated across various sectors of our lives, in policing, our justice system, healthcare, education, so on. So as an example, in courts, algorithms are used to determine defendants' level of risk, which then guides bail, sentencing recommendations, and parole decisions. And in a way, AI gives these decisions a veneer of objectivity, right? So it's not just the human with all of our biases who are making the tough call. It's a mathematical algorithm, which is hard to refute. And this is what Sundar has called the machine heuristic here, which is when we attribute machine-like qualities such as objectivity, neutrality, systematic thinking to human-machine interactions. And this is manifested in how people have disclosed sensitive information online, so they trust machine agents with their personal information than they do a human agent. It's also been relevant in a news context, so earlier research on this, particularly what Sundar has done with NAS, has found that people tend to think that news that was selected by a machine editor is more credible than what a human has curated. Although I should say that other research testing this dynamic has been mixed. Some more recent research, either finding no effect on credibility or perceptions of the opposite effect. So in that case where there's been the opposite effect, where people have found human news selection more credible, the explanation there has been this idea of negative expectancy violations, right, rather than the machine heuristic. So in other words, subjects still perceive the news to be a human's job, so selecting the news to be a human's job. And so this expectation negatively affected their perceptions of automated news credibility in that case. So therefore, the context and the expectations or assumptions that go along with how we interpret these kinds of decisions appears to be important. As going along with this, there's been more recent research that has found support for an anthropocentric expectant, a lot of words, a lot of syllables, anthropocentric expectancy bias, which basically produces negative feelings when people expect to interact with a human and they have to interact with a machine instead. So I found this with Dr. Katz and Dr. Groshek on some work that we've done looking at a customer service context, right, where we've seen that people vastly prefer the in-person customer service interactions over the automated ones. And so we try to explain this difference in people's preferences, potentially based on the goals that they have for a certain context. So in a customer service context, right, we may want human fallibility, flexibility, and bias, right? Because we could maybe negotiate with the customer service agent and try to get them to skirt the rules for us, whereas if we were interacting with the machine, that rigidity would hamper us in that kind of a goal. And so in some ways, AI continues with how we've originally conceived of technology. It's first and foremost been put to us as tools to ease our load or amplify our capabilities. But as it creeps into these softer areas of our lives, or the areas where their impact is more explicit and direct, so where they're making decisions for us where humans otherwise might have, we might begin to be thinking of this differently. To a large degree, robots also are put forth as another technological tool to aid us. But in other ways, they're a departure from how we've originally conceived of technology. So AI and their robots are autonomous. So while we as humans create it, once the AI or the robot is set loose to make its own decisions, it's not being wielded as directly by us as we might otherwise be directly handling our phones or a crane, to bring back the industrial context there. And we know that we do respond emotionally to our technology. So Vincent's work on the mobile phone is one such example. Such that the technology takes on a larger role in our lives than a prosaic tool like a hammer or some scissors might. And I think this has become particularly poignant and salient right now in what we've observed so far with this quarantine in the pandemic, and sort of in terms of how we're handling it. Speaking only for myself, my friends and my family are reaching out more than ever and sort of clinging to these virtual hangouts as social lifelines. I can't imagine losing internet access or dropping my phone in water, the extent to which that would really upend my life in terms of severing our social capacity, right? So we may intend to or think that we should treat robots as another tool, but robots' key functionalities, right, the fact that they're interactive and they're autonomous, that have these explicit social cues, may elicit stronger social and emotional responses. And so it seems possible or even likely that in the future there will be this kind of ontological leap between the functional idea of technology and then the social responses that might create some friction for people as they're navigating this new technology. So a further step in understanding these possible dynamics is how people perceive AI as decision makers and robots as social and human-like entities, specifically in terms of attitudes related to robot integration in our lives. So I'm going to go a little bit into the theoretical background first before diving more into the specific studies that I want to talk about today. So first, to discuss a little bit more this notion of human-machine communication, because I think it's particularly relevant here, in that HMC has arisen in the last few years as an alternative paradigm in the communication discipline to computer-mediated communication, so CMC. The key distinction here being that within CMC, technology is viewed as a communicative channel, and in HMC, technology is viewed as a communicative partner. So something with which we make meaning, as opposed to CMC, where technology is something through which people make meaning. And so as an example here, right, we have Instagram or other social media channels we can think of as a CMC channel, where we present ourselves, we curate what we share in our lives, and we interact with our friends, but there's a human presumably on the other end of that kind of information conveyance, as opposed to something like Alexa, which is more along the lines of an HMC platform. So we're speaking with her and her only, right? The information conveyance stops there and she interacts with us directly. And I should say here that there are myriad functions that robots might serve in the future. And there are a number of disciplines that study robots already, right? So HMC is not the pioneer right now in terms of studying robots. We've got computer science, engineering, psychology, philosophy, right? All of these disciplines have grappled with some of these related questions. And so we have some cross-disciplinary work already in human-robot interaction, human-computer interaction, and there's a lot of overlap between these three HRI, HCI, and HMC sort of fields. And to varying degrees, these fields that exist already have examined the ways in which robots' functionality, so what they look like, what they sound like, how they move, how they behave, affects human responses to and perceptions of them. And often these inquiries largely rest on a good-bad paradigm, right? So if a robot looks a certain way or performs a certain action, will people feel more positively or negatively towards it? And so the impetus for carving out a new space for HMC was really to emphasize the social aspect of communicating with machines and those implications. And so then this notion of implications is how I landed here, guided theoretically by both media equation theory and apparatgeist. Media equation has established that people respond socially to machines, and that this is an unconscious reflexive response. So media equation studies have shown that people apply gender stereotypes, in-group, out-group biases, and social norms like politeness to machines like computers and televisions, which I should mention also have quite minimal social cues, right, compared to the technology we're talking about today, which have a lot more explicit social cues. And their explanation for this is that we're still operating with old brains that automatically trigger mental scripts when they're cued by even small social indicators. So therefore, as I said, machines like robots that are embodied, they have voices and so on, we might expect that these more explicit social cues could elicit stronger social responses. And so these assumptions about human behavior that have been used to test media equation hypotheses have also been flipped, right? So the media equation has also found that we can derive understanding of human behavior based on how they treat computers as well. And this is a similar assertion that's been made by apparatgeist theory, that human behavior can be revealed through the design and the use of technology. It was initially developed in the study of mobile phones, which revealed a sociologic of perpetual contact that the technology elicited from people, which ultimately had implications for the nature of public space, our interpersonal interactions, and our social relationships. So I'll say here that the relative size of these circles is not to flatter or offend anyone, but mostly to demonstrate the level of analysis for both, right? So that media equation operates at the individual level, right? So how individuals respond to and use technology. And apparatgeist, while it studies individuals, really widens the scope of implications for that individual behavior. So I think it's an instructive framework for untangling the social implications potentially that treating machines socially might have. And so that's why I see these both as complementary pillars and are what is guiding the questions for all of the studies that I'll be talking about in this study. I also, before diving into the specific studies, I want to make a brief note about some of the variables that these studies contain in terms of measuring respondents' individual differences, and these won't be included in the main research questions, but they are included, these traits are measured and included in the studies because the literature does suggest that there are individual differences in terms of how people approach and respond to technology. So specifically with demographics, gender and age tend to be quite pertinent to how people respond. So men have been shown to be a lot more open to technology than women. Likewise, younger people tend to adopt technology more frequently than older people do. Extroverts similarly are more open to new technology. And this personality trait also seems particularly relevant for interactive technology like robots and AI, right? So extroverts, how much you like talking to strangers, and robots and AI are certainly potential social interactants there. And research has shown that those who are higher in extroversion tend to be more comfortable with robots, and they also tend to humanize them more. The inverse is true for those who are higher in neuroticism. So neuroticism is sort of how stable you are emotionally. People who are more neurotic tend to be less comfortable and less likely to humanize robots. The notion of control, I think, is really important here, and it's been already incorporated in a number of theories about intention and behavior towards technology. So here I'm thinking of the technology acceptance model, TAM, and the theory of planned behavior. While these original models don't directly include locus of control, they do include variables that relate to feelings of self-efficacy. And more recent studies have found locus of control to be an antecedent of variables like the TAM variables of perceived ease of use and usefulness. So that's included here because it seems an important antecedent variable to people's attitudes towards technology. And then more related, still related to self-efficacy, but more related to particularly self-efficacy with technology is perceived technology competence. Generally, people who have higher tech competence tend to also be more comfortable with technology. And then religious affiliation and religiosity are also really important for robot perceptions in particular, because of the ways that religious beliefs and affiliations can influence how people approach or perceive the nature of aliveness and being and what that means. So just a quick note on those sorts of traits that are also going to be included. So moving into the meat of the talk now, I've done the underlying theoretical frameworks and some caveats there. And so now I want to dive into the specific studies that I'll be covering. First, I'll be looking at social perceptions of robots. I'll be talking about a study that we've done where the focus was on the robot's appearance in terms of their physical humanness and gender. And then I'll review findings from another study on people's perceptions of and comfort of the AI in various roles. I should say here that these first two studies have been group efforts. So Dr. Katz has instigated really this larger body of work and been a critical part of all of these studies. And Skylar Lay has also come in a little later and been really important in the work, particularly with AI perceptions. So I wanted to give a little shout out to them. And then I'm going to include with a discussion of how these findings have informed the current study that I'm working on for my dissertation. And if anyone can identify the Sondheim shout out in this slide, you'll get imaginary bonus points from me. Okay. So moving into robot perceptions, the first study that I want to talk about, which is really related to the physical humanness and the gender of the robot. So first talking about physical humanness, the influence of a robot's human appearance, to be clear, is not a new question. Decades ago, there was a Japanese researcher, Mori, who developed this idea of the uncanny valley, which was created to explicate people's reactions to robots with varying physical forms, right? So the proposition here is that people like machines the more they appear as humans up to a point. You see that cliff drop off on the chart here when we get to a humanoid robot with skin. The notion here is essentially that as human likeness increases, likability increases until human likeness gets too similar to what we look like as humans, and then likability does a real nosedive down into creepiness. And then the question about this human likeness, though, has been raised in terms of how we actually measure that, because there's really two different ways that researchers looked at this. The first is subjective human likeness. So how much humanness do people attribute to a robot? So this is quite similar to anthropomorphism, right, and our ability to do that. And then there's also objective human likeness, which is more related to the actual physical, what we're seeing in front of us. So how many human-like features does the robot have? And so I raise that question of the objective versus subjective measurement because the uncanny valley does demonstrate a disjuncture between subjective human likeness, right? So how human do I think this robot is? And then objective human likeness, which is how much does this robot physically appear like a human being? There have been a number of explanations proposed for why this gap exists, and two that particularly inform this larger work that I'm presenting today are the distinctiveness hypothesis and the dehumanization hypothesis. So very briefly, I can't go too much into depth with it, but the threat to distinctiveness hypothesis basically refers to people's desire to maintain their dominance over other living beings, right? So we want to be top of the hierarchy as humans. We like that position there. And then somewhat different, the dehumanization hypothesis asserts that as people anthropomorphize a robot, they become more attuned to its mechanistic features, which then triggers the uncanny feeling. And then on the other hand, there's also been some research that's shown that the more human appearing robots elicit more empathy when they're mistreated. So the question kind of remains in terms of social perceptions of robots, whether people will have an uncanny response or more of an empathy-driven one. And I want to be clear here that this study that I'm talking about includes both subjective and objective human likeness, in that the objective human likeness is an independent variable. And then people's subjective human likeness, so how much they perceive the robot to have human qualities that are not physical, is a dependent variable here. Okay, and then also talking about gender, so there has been some research, though less than the physical humanist aspect, on the influence of robot gender on perceptions in particular. So Eisel and Hegel do a lot of work on this, on robots and gender, and they've found that people do apply gender stereotypes to robots. So basically, I believe the manipulation they did is that it was just based on hair length. So a male haircut versus a female haircut on the same robot. And people attributed more female-like qualities to the robot with long hair, stereotypically female-like qualities like communalness and a capacity for softer work like caretaking. And then they preferred for the short-haired robot, so the more male robot, less sort of communal values, more individualism, and also more of they wanted that robot to do more tech-oriented kinds of tasks. But we've also found excuse me, Siegel and Riesel and Norton have found also in looking at whether women and men have gender preferences for robots, that basically people generally have a tendency to prefer the opposite gendered robot. And this was especially true for men, that the strength of the effect there was that men preferred female robots. I should say about this study though, that the interaction between the human and the robot was that the robot was asking for a monetary donation. So there's an element of dominance there that's intrinsic to that manipulation, and I'll discuss more of that aspect in the second study and upcoming work. So then moving into the research questions, two sort of broad exploratory questions of asking about the extent to which the robot's appearance, which ranges from humanoid, which actually means less human-like, to android, which means more human-like, how that affects general attitudes about robots and social perceptions of robots. And then the second research question asks about whether the robot's gender, so we had 3, male, female, and agender, whether that affects general attitudes about robots and social perceptions of robots. And so to investigate this, these questions, we developed an online survey questionnaire that was kind of like a quasi-experiment there, because we do have a manipulation with what robots we showed people. So for the sample, quotas were specified for gender, age, race, education, and income to try to get as representative a sample as possible. In terms of the manipulation, we split the sample into, so it was between subjects. And so about a third saw the agender, the female, and the male robot, and then we're asked to answer these questions about perceptions of the robot. And so these are the questions that we had these are the measures that we included. So as I mentioned, some of the independent variables are also these individual traits that are of interest, their demographics, of course, and then the main manipulations, which is the robot traits, right, of their gender and their human likeness. And then we also had these dependent variables of people's cyber dystopia, their robot, so cyber dystopia is basically, generally speaking, how nervous they are about robots being a part of society, of our human society. Robot phobia is a similar-ish kind of measure, but slightly more individual based. So how phobic as an individual are you in thinking about a robot in your life? And so those are more the general attitudes, and then this robot liking and imagined relational closeness is more the social perceptions of the robot. So how much do people just like the robot and thinking about the robot as part of their life? And then the imagined relational closeness is actually an adapted scale from an interpersonal closeness scale. So based on human to human, really interpersonal relationships. And then I swapped out person for robot. So a little bit strange because it asks certain questions like how much will you think about your robot when you're doing things? But I do think that this will become a more relevant measure as people are adopting robots into our lives in the future. And so going first into just the straight differences in between the 3 manipulations. So we ran one ways and novas across the 3 conditions to see how perceptions differed. And what was really interesting here, so as you can see, everyone preferred the agender robot the most over the male and the female robot here. But what was interesting is that in terms of the post hoc comparisons, there was really only consistent significant differences between the agender robot and the male robot. And then there weren't really significant differences between the agender robot and the female robot in terms of these things. So people sort of lumped the agender and female robot closer together, and then the male robot was just categorically significantly different from those two in terms of these measures of phobia and liking and robot human likeness here. And so we ran a couple of models to control for these traits. And so for the ease of presentation, I've only included the significant predictors in the model rather than forcing you all to look at a regression table for each of these variables. And so in cyber dystopia, what we see here is that the subjective robot human likeness is important. So the more people perceive the robot as like a human, actually the higher the higher their cyber dystopia. So maybe imagining a robot like a human sort of really raised their hackles in terms of imagining its negative influence on society. And then also in terms of demographics, as we see, it's actually interesting that men, I'll get back to this in a little bit, but that men also had higher cyber dystopia than the women did. Which is perhaps related to, I say it's interesting because later in the models, men generally liked the robot a lot more, but they also had higher cyber dystopic views. And I think that might just be related to the fact that robots maybe threaten some of the more typically male dominated industries as opposed to women. And so perhaps that drove their concerns there. And then we saw that older people with a higher income had higher cyber dystopia. But then education was negatively related. So the more educated people were, the less they had cyber dystopia, which again could be related to the kind of industries that robots are threatening right now. So less highly educated people might feel a little more threatened by robots' integration there. And then in terms of the individual traits, we see, not surprisingly, that people who are more neurotic have higher cyber dystopia. But then also that so people who were who were more religious also had more cyber dystopia there. And so then moving on to robot phobia. So an interesting, actually negative relationship with robot human likeness, although this was not super strong as a predictor, but that the less people saw the robot as human-like, the more robot phobia they had. And then income was, the thing is that the first two blocks were not actually significant to the model. So I sort of hesitate to even go over these variables too much. It really seemed that the individual traits here were really important in terms of people's robot phobia. So those who were more neurotic were very much more higher in robot phobia, and same with religiousness. And then but we see a negative relationship here with perceived technology competence. So those who felt that they were more technologically competent had less robot phobia, which I think makes sense in terms of they probably feel like they're more capable of grappling with the technology than those who feel like they're less technologically competent. And then moving into the social perceptions here, we see a lot more explanatory power in terms of the variables that we're including here. So 53.6% of people's robot liking was explained by the variables displayed here. And in particular, the robot traits become a lot more important, which I think makes sense because this is more of a social perception. So the traits of the robot as a social interactant might be a lot more critical. In particular, people perceiving the robot as more human-like subjectively had a much stronger robot liking. Also, the agender robot was more related to robot liking, which makes sense given the ANOVA results. Similarly, men like the robot more. Interestingly, that older people like the robot more. That doesn't really track generally with what the research has found, the literature. And then people with a higher income like the robot more. And then individual traits had somewhat of a contributed somewhat of the explanation here in terms of those who were higher in internal locus of control like the robot less. So locus of control is how much you think that you have control over the happenings in your life. And so when you have an internal locus of control, you feel like you have a lot more control over your fate. And so people who felt like they had more control of their life did not like the robot as much. And likewise, people who are Christian did not like the robot as much. But then again, we see the same trend with technology competence, of people who are higher in their perceived technology competence like the robot more, which makes sense. And then we see similar patterns, again, for imagined relational closeness. Robot-human likeness was really important. No one wanted to have people did not want to have a relationship with a male robot. That was negatively related. Interestingly, extroversion comes into play more here, right? So the people who are more extroverted could imagine having more of a close relationship with a robot, and I think that makes a lot of sense. People with high internal locus of control also did not imagine a close relationship with the robot. And again, people who were more technologically competent had a higher imagined relational closeness. So we're seeing some consistent trends across these, right? That this subjective robot-human likeness is a strong positive predictor of both the negative and social perceptions, which is probably something to be explored a little further in other studies, certainly. Men had more negative general perceptions and also more positive social perceptions. So it could just be that men feel more strongly about this stuff in general, and they can see both that there might be a threat from robots in the future, but also that they would like robots more if robots were part of their lives in the future. And then we do see that the personality traits do play a role, which I think is important to remember when we're thinking about this technology and the kinds of affordances that they have, that it's not totally deterministic in terms of how people will not be responding necessarily in a uniform way, that these individual differences are going to be important in terms of adoption and use. So moving into the second study, which is more generally about AI perceptions in terms of how AI can fit into our lives. And when we go into this thinking about what David Gunkel has termed this relational turn in human-computer interaction. So Gunkel has identified with this new technology, it speaks to the emergence of HMC and also new considerations for studying these interactions, right? So that in this third wave, that there's sort of a relationship, more of a relationship between the human and the machine, in which people can create meaning, perhaps directed towards themselves and about other human relationships. And Hoflick has similarly identified that the technology may create a new dynamic between human and machines. So we have this dyadic model with CMC, right? So the computer is a channel in CMC through which two people communicate. But then with HMC, we have a third communicant, right? And so there's more of a triadic model of a human and a machine. And so Hoflick argues that there might be interesting new dynamics that emerge between humans in response to the machine as a third interactant there. And as these emerging dynamics may create new scenarios for meaning making, Turkel has also observed that these social robots may serve as relational artifacts, meaning that they would prompt reflection from ourselves about what it means to be alive, what it means to be uniquely human. Basically that they are a point of reflection for our own identity and relationships. And so in this process, it seems there may be a desire to sort and categorize who belongs where. And so that's where we come to this question about the social roles of AI. And a way to begin examining how people might feel about an AI entity taking on social roles is through this social distance construct, which is a sociological concept. Social distance is a sociological concept that originated initially in examining human-to-human relations to explain intimacy with others, intergroup perceptions, and identification. So things like bias, right? So if you're more socially distant from someone, you would be more likely to have a stronger bias against them potentially. So this has somewhat been studied a little bit in relation to robots. In these studies, it's been shown that people preferred a higher status robot to be physically close and a lower robot status robot to be farther away. And there's also been, people have been more critical of a supervisory robot when they rely on it to complete tasks. So this is a potential interesting way to examine these dynamics. And so we ask in this survey, we give a series of roles that AI, and AI agent is how we termed it, because AI is a kind of an amorphous concept. It's a complicated process. And so we use the term AI agent to simplify people imagining AI in an actual role in social life. So we asked, does an AI agent's role influence how comfortable people are with AI, and also to what extent do personality traits, these personality traits from the previous study that we saw were important, to what extent do they affect comfort with AI? And so again, going into the method briefly, it's quite similar to the first study. It's an online survey questionnaire, bigger sample this time, similar quotas specified for representativeness. Again, our independent variables are these demographics and personality traits. And in this case, our dependent variable is this question of how comfortable would you be with an AI agent in these roles that are presented here. So a country leader, town mayor, company leader, work manager, therapist, work advisor, coworker, personal assistant. And what we did first, before diving into further analysis using this as a single DV, was actually to determine whether it was a unidimensional construct or perhaps a multidimensional construct. And what we found through a factor analysis is that it is a multidimensional construct, right? So that there was a very clear division in this factor analysis of AI with power, people having a certain perception of that, versus AI as a peer, right? So I think logically that makes sense also on its face. Therapist was somewhat in between these two. There wasn't a really nice, clear division. So for now, we've dropped therapist from either of those variables. And so moving forward, we had two dependent variables then in terms of comfort with AI, one with AI with power and one with AI as peer. And I wanted to show you just the descriptive statistics of these perceptions of the comfort with AI in various roles. As you can see, right, the superior AI, people are not happy about it. It's mostly really uncomfortable. But then you do see as we get into more peer or subordinate roles, like an advisor, coworker, an assistant, an increase in the comfort levels of people there. And then we ran two models to sort of explore what's going on here. And what we see with the AI in power is, similar to some of the findings with the robot, in that men were more comfortable with AI overall, both with AI in a power position and AI as a peer. Younger people also were more comfortable with AI overall. I thought it was really interesting in comparing these two models that white people were more comfortable with AI in power. This was a dummy race variable that was created, but it was not a significant predictor in the AI as peer. And this would need to be dug into a lot more, and potentially another study or qualitative study even. I suspect potentially that people who are minorities, non-white minorities, I probably maybe have more experience with AI or sort of external systems being less favorable towards them, and so they have more to fear or feel less comfortable about with AI as opposed to white people, but that's just a speculation on my part. Individual traits were more important than the demographics here, as you can see, in terms of their explanatory power, but we also see very similar trends across both. It just seems to be a little bit stronger for the most part with AI as power as opposed to peer. So people who are more extroverted were more open, were more comfortable with both. Locus of control was really strong with AI as power. So people who had a higher internal locus of control, or so people who felt like they had more control of their life, were really uncomfortable with AI as power. And it's a less strong relationship in the AI as peer, although it still exists there. So I thought that was interesting, and it makes sense that people with not control issues, but who maybe feel more self-efficacy would feel a little bit more uneasy about an AI decision maker there. Perceived technology, so people who felt that they were more technologically competent, though, were more open to AI, which I think makes sense. And then I didn't explain this robot phobia variable earlier, but this was included mostly to stand in for experiential traits. So people who've had experience with robots, to get a sense of sort of that seemed to be an important thing, right? So people who had certain perceptions of AI already, which is robots are sort of a manifestation of an AI agent. And so we include a robot phobia in here. And indeed, we do see that this is important, right? That people's general fear of robots, of an AI agent, of course, would negatively affect their comfort with AI there. And so then we also do in both of our studies, but I'm just showing the qualitative results for the AI study. We asked respondents open-ended, like just ask them in an open-ended way, do you have any thoughts about what was asked on this survey? And so it's completely voluntary, it's not required. And so we do tend to get really interesting illustrative comments from people. I think in the 2,200 person survey, we had something like 800 responses, open-ended comments from people. So obviously this is just a really select example of some of the quotes that people had, but I think that they complement the quantitative findings. In this first quote, this person is saying that AI is amazing and recognize the benefits of it, but that we need to be careful about how much we wield AI, in terms of also then speaking to this idea of status, right? And that that AI should always be below or equivalent to humans, and they should never have more power than we do. And this is pretty common, this notion that there's a lot of possibility with AI, but there's also a good amount of peril if it goes unchecked, right? And this was, I thought, a funny quote of recognizing human fallibility and the fact that, you know, we are the ones, and several comments spoke to this, that recognizing that people are the ones who are creating these algorithms. And so this person said, I feel like humanity's failings would rub off on a perfectly behaved AI, and something might happen. Meaning, right, like the AIs are created by humans and they also learn from humans. And so that's something to keep in mind also with our own fallibility and foibles, I suppose, in terms of potential negative consequences there. And then this one I thought was a really poignant reminder of potential issues with AI, right? This person says, when they hear AI, it just means a way to assist humans in areas where human decisions aren't necessary. So really conscripting the context in which AI is relevant or important. And so they continued, otherwise there are too many nuances for AI to handle. So this idea that human reasoning is really important. In particular, she continues, my husband is relegated to a low level of achievement in his high school in the projects of New Jersey, but 4 years ago, he graduated at the top of his university class. Just because someone's history indicates one thing doesn't mean it is all that clear, and AI would have kept him from college based on past performance. So I thought this was an interesting notion of acknowledging that how AI derives its decision making, and that you know, it does, but it could potentially stymie growth and human potential, because it doesn't have that kind of flexibility of human reasoning there. And then finally, this last person, speaking directly to this notion of status, said that they're uncomfortable with AI and concepts of leadership and in therapies, but feel fine with the concept of advising, scheduling, and assistant. I believe that people in personal accountability allows people to succeed with the drive, but if AI is in leadership positions, then how do individuals succeed? So again, this notion, similar to what some of the negative concerns have been about robots in an industrial context, that it would be displacing humans' work, but sort of on a broader scale, right? Like keeping in mind that AI is a tool to enhance human potential and progress, and that we need to be careful about still allowing humans to be able to grow and develop in their potential also. And so now I want to briefly talk about future work in terms of how these two studies have now informed what my dissertation is going to be on in terms of appearance and status here. So just speaking a little bit more in terms of the importance of appearance and status together considering it, there's been some research that's shown that that robot appearance should align with the job and task at hand. So in some work, researchers have found that human-like robots were preferred for socially and artistically oriented jobs. And that also the perceived human likeness, so that subjective human likeness, was related to more of an acceptance of a robot as a social companion, which is what we're sort of looking towards in the future. And related to that, in terms of status, are these and appearance are in-group and out-group bias. So if a robot appears similar to us or different to us, does that have any bearing on our potential bias against or for the robot, so our liking of it? And then also these threat to distinctiveness considerations. So as a robot appears more human or appears more like a female or a male, do we start to feel our human uniqueness threatened, and therefore our comfy place on the top of the hierarchy threatened, and does that have an effect in terms of how we perceive robots and act towards them? And so tying these threads together, I arrive at the main objects of interest for my current work, which for now I'm referring to as robot humanization. The aim here is to hit on all three aspects of the HMC research agenda. So again, moving beyond functionality and also considering the social and the metaphysical aspects of robots. There's a well-established line of research already on these first four concepts here. So the likability, the human likeness, physical humanness, gender, and I've reviewed some of that today. But these are also largely the functional aspects of human-machine interaction, although I would say that gender may start to get at that social element of interaction for us. And so really the new elements that my current work adds are these questions of status, so the relative positioning of human to machine, and rights. So again, these first four primarily hit on interpersonal dynamics, but rights widens the inquiry to consider how robots may be situated, not just with regards to another individual, but within society at large. So to just show that in a more sort of methodological way, this is the way the study would be set up. It's a between subjects online experiment. And so we have a 2x2x3 design. And then the dependent variables are going to be the likability, human likeness, and robot rights. And we'll see how the robot's physical humanness of less or more human, and then male versus female, and then, the formatting got a little screwed up on the status here, but superior, peer, and subordinate, how those affect these dependent variables of likability, human likeness, and robot rights. This is, again, just a fuller, I guess, more boring visualization of the study here. As I mentioned, also these personality traits, individual difference traits, will be considered as well and controlled for in this study, because they seem to have an influence in terms of people's perceptions. And that is what I have for you today. Thank you so much for your attention. And I'm going to switch off the screen sharing now to answer questions. And I think we're going to be answering questions using the Zoom chat function primarily. So Okay, I'm going to go to the chat now. So Rachel has a question here about how I measured extroversion and neuroticism as independent variables. I'm not sure if you're asking whether you see them as overlapping or just the questions about how to measure them, but all of the personality traits were measured using adapted scales from the literature. So extroversion and neuroticism were used from iSync and iSync. You'll recognize those. They're part of the big 5 personality traits. And the reason why I didn't include all 5 of the big 5 was mostly about respondent fatigue. It's a pretty long survey as it is. And extroversion and neuroticism have been found in particular to be powerful predictors of certain, in particular, these technology perceptions and so that's why I included those. I am for this current study, I'm also including innovativeness as a personality trait because I'm adding that in there because I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Everett diffusion of innovations. How do I describe that? Model, I guess, or theory, in which innovativeness in terms of early and late adapters is important. So I'm also going to incorporate that. So that's, let me know if that didn't answer your question, Rachel. And then, so you can send feedback either to my email address, kkmays@bu.edu. I can write that in the chat for people, or you can write some feedback in the chat, that's fine. So Tiernan asks, I'm wondering if you could potentially connect your findings to design considerations for collaborative AI as it stands right now. Are there ways that HMC interfaces can be better tuned for particular use cases or user classes? I think that's an interesting question, Tiernan. I'm wondering if you can give a little more details in terms of what specific kind of technology and classes or use cases that you have in mind, I guess. Because I'm not, I think in terms of, I don't know if these are actual features, but I think that this notion of control being really important for people, so people feeling in control is really important with this technology. So particularly with the AI agents, people emphasized that they're okay with AI having input, but that having final decision was really not great. So I think if it's even just an indicator ensuring people that like a human reviewed this final decision from the AI and signed off on it, that would go a long way in terms of people feeling more comfortable with it. I think so. Yeah, I think features that make people feel like they're having more influence over the technology will probably be important. But if you have more specific use cases in mind, let me know. Yeah, Skylar has a good question asking about the stimuli. This has been so far the most difficult part of of these kinds of studies so far. Yes, the male robot does look creepy. As a little backstory for people, Skylar has been subjected to a lot of pre-tests on my part in terms of testing these surveys to make sure just even that they're, you know, the randomization is working or whatever. So she'll go through all of them and she's subjected to seeing a lot of different pictures of robots that I might be testing out. And there's a lot of them, and a lot of the male ones. I should say there are a lot of robots and there are not a lot of male robots actually out there that you can find images, good quality images at least, that are readily available. And they all are sort of creepy. And so I did creepy and threatening. And I don't know if it's I think part of it is yeah, it seems like the female robots are made more to smile, and then the male robots, you cannot find a picture of a male robot smiling. The best I can find is of one like kind of grimacing a little bit. So I'm actually on a second round of pretest right now for the robot images, because the first pretest, I wanted to make sure that the robots were different in terms of humanness and different in terms of gender, but I wanted the threat perception, I guess is the way I'll term that variable, to not be significantly different across the stimuli, because we have gotten legitimate feedback about the external validity of the stimuli in terms of the man just looking inherently more threatening and creepy, and that's affecting it, and it's not the gender differences at all. And so I'm on a second round of pretest now. I dug deeper to try to find more male robots, and I have a couple, but that might just be an inherent flaw right now in terms of these designs. And it says something about the direction that the industry is going right now, in terms of really much more emphasizing either female or these sort of agender types of robots, and that no one's really interested in having a male robot. And that might just be because they're all assistive right now, and who knows in the future what. I was reading about voice assistants originally, when the GPS machines were coming out, it actually, people preferred the male voice when they weren't used to the technology yet, because they didn't want to be given directions by a female. But then as soon as they got more assimilated to the technology, the preference switched and people wanted the female voice. So yeah, it might be interesting to see where the industry goes on that. But I think it's important to keep in mind in terms of what their decisions are and the effect that has on what we see as normal. Okay. Right. So I'm not, Mara, I'm not totally sure what your question is, but it is a really good point that our entertainment, what we're exposed to entertainment-wise for robots is potentially really might affect how we perceive these future iterations of robots. Certainly, I don't know how many people here are watching Westworld. I just started season 3. It's a great show. But yeah, those robots really took a turn in Westworld. No spoilers for anybody, but so yeah, you can imagine certain depending on people's exposure and the culture, what their perceptions would be. And so that is why for this upcoming study, I'm more intentionally including some measures of previous robot exposure or assumptions there to try to control for some of that, for some of those potential confounds. And then Dr. Katz is asking about policy implications, which is of course really important to consider. And I think I touched on it a little bit with my little segue about, not segue, but sojourn about GPS voices, which is, that if we only have these technologies as female or non-male, the potential implications in terms of our socialization and how we perceive other people in our lives, so women and men, if this assistive technology is exclusively female, I don't think that would have good implications for, we are trying to, I think a lot of sectors are trying to move towards gender parity. And when we have these technologies that are potentially actively working against that kind of goal for gender parity, if there's this implicit sort of assumption that in certain roles, certain genders are fit more than others. So I think it's really important to be researching this, because I don't think that the market researchers in these companies are really, that's not their main concern. Their main concern is, well, what's liked? What do people prefer? And sure, it seems clear that people prefer the female or the agender. And it could be that maybe we say, you know what, we should not have superhuman looking robots at all. Like if you can't, if it has to be female and no male in that case, then maybe we just stop at robots that don't look too much like humans to try to avoid that kind of potential negative socialization in terms of how we're interacting with these robots long term. But that needs to be figured out so that there can be a very clear policy recommendation that there's a danger to pushing this further than it really needs to go. I like to say that just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do something. So like, yeah, Westworld sort of, we all imagine like, whoa, so crazy that like people could look like humans, like robots could look like, people could look like, Jesus, so robots could look like humans. But it's not, maybe we just shouldn't go there. But maybe I'm being too negative about it. So thank you for that question, Dr. Katz. It's always important to keep in mind, I think. Okay, and then Tiernan has a follow-up here. Oh, I see. So he says he's mostly thinking of situations where an AI is interacting with a human worker and offering suggestions or asking for confirmation. And if there are particular framing that could be used in a chat interface, for instance, that would make that less challenging for the human user. And maybe even if that might depend on individual differences that could be accounted for based on person, right? Sure, the context. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, Tiernan, and I don't have all the answers for you on that, particularly because I think interface features, I haven't quite been, the smaller interface features that that you're speaking about in terms of potential like, framing or voice. I mean, there's been some work that's shown that like automated agents that have vocal fry or that include a lot of these equivocations that humans use has been more appealing to people because it seems a little more authentic and maybe a little less sort of like automated and robotic. But yeah, I think that's I think I think in terms of this notion of in like a customer service context, like the human heuristic that I talked about in terms of people wanting to think that there is human reasoning going on in certain contexts depending on their goals. I don't know if people would really be that amenable to an automated an agent they know is automated trying to mimic nuance and flexibility because there might be a real sort of bias already about what the machine is going to do and not trusting that. But I think that's something that would be really interesting to study further, certainly, in that context. And then Dr. Katz suggested it may be that people want to look like robots. Yeah, sure. Bionic arms and whatever. I mean, there is some work in terms of like integrating more robotic elements into our human selves to try to amplify our capabilities. But that's a little out of the scope of what I'm looking at now, but certainly interesting to think about. Due to that we want to look like robots due to the virus. Yeah. Oh, I understand. Right. Because we all want to, right. It's really good mime work there. Yeah. So good object work. Yeah. Right. So that we might want to have a huge protective layering of ourselves like robots do. Yeah. Sure. But let's get that to the healthcare workers first, probably, and then we can move on to ourselves. So, all right. Jim, do you have?
I think you've done I don't have any mind work for you, no, but or any additional questions at this time, but I imagine there'll be a dissertation defense down the road where I'll have plenty for you. I'd like first for all of us to mime or through emotes or anything else to thank Kate once again for joining us today and giving such a wonderful talk. It's very much appreciated. Particularly being, as you've been so many times over the last few years, the intrepid explorer to try something new for the first time. I think this worked out relatively okay. I'd also like to thank all of you that have been here, quote unquote, in attendance today for our virtual colloquium session. Unfortunately, our upcoming colloquium in light of circumstances has been canceled, as has our distinguished lecture series for the semester. So I apologize that this may actually be the last get-together we have for a formal CRC colloquium this semester. I thank all of you for being here to be a part of it. I thank you for your participation and engagement to the extent that, again, technological affordances permit. I wish you all well with the remainder of the semester. And Kate, thank you once again.
Thanks all of you for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
See you all at some point, some of you. All right, bye.
Have a good day all. Thank you.